Hi everyone and welcome to social science classes and class 8. So today's topic is going to be education and social reforms, and this is your part 1. It's a big chapter, so I'm going to take two classes on this particular lesson. So this is your chapter number 6 and the pages are 43 to 45. So as you can see here in this picture, there is a woman and you can see a fire burning there, and there's another woman a little older than that one in trying to push that woman into fire. So this signifies a lot about the religion that was practiced in ancient India. So this is a practice of sati, where if your husband dies before you, the woman was not supposed to live but was supposed to sit in the pyre and die by, I would call it a suicide only. So like this, there were other things in the Hindu religion which actually wanted a change, which had to be changed in order to survive, in order to come to the modern religion of Hinduism that we are living in. Education was basically only about the text that we read, the text in Sanskrit that we learned. Education was not universal. It was only about boys, and that too rich boys having the education. So that is why the need for education and social reforms was felt, and the whole era, this is known as social reforms and reformers. So who were the people who came and reformed, and what was it that they had to reform? So today's part, we are going to say the aspects, the features, the principles that needed reform. So education in India can be traced back to the 19th century, when it was mostly religious in nature. So what we were trying to learn through pathshalas and madrasas were teaching about the Sanskrit, the Hindu religion, whereas the madrasa was talking and teaching about Islam. So it was only religious education that was parted. There was no science, there was no mathematics, and those are the two things that make you logical. So there was no scientific temper. That is why the dogmas were there. That is why you followed the traditionally followed custom. There were blind belief. So both Hindu and Islamic education was traditional and aimed towards conserving their existing customs. So they did not want to leave those customs. So subject like law, medicine, literature, logic, classical language, they were taught, but religion was most important. Now boys were educated at home, whereas girls did not have access to education. Now when the Britishers started ruling India, the first thing that they started was a network of elementary schools, and students here were also taught few religious passages. Now Christian missionaries, they opened school, and these schools, even today in India, we have lots of Christian missionary schools. So they started printing the material for education, and when they started printing, people started reading instead of just learning by memory and saying it out to the teacher. So that printing helped you to read. It also helped you to understand more, because you could read again and again instead of just listening to the text and revising it as a memory. So the British introduced the new education system, and it was primarily based on English. So they neglected the study of Indian languages, and but the important thing was that it was based on logic and scientific research. So many school, colleges and universities were open to spread the study of English, and a syllabus was made and attention was given to technical education. So earlier there was no curriculum, there was no written syllabus. Now even a syllabus started. So why did the Britishers felt the need to have a new education system? Why not the same traditional method that was adopted before they came? Now, the reason was Indians would become semi-English by learning their language. Macaulay was the one who introduced education. He's called the founder of British education in India. So he thought that the Indians would only be Indians by their color, but their ideals, intelligence and interest would become like the British. So what they felt that if Indians became more British, they would be easily accepting the British rule. They will not think of gaining independence because they would be Britishers in letter and spirit. Did that really happen, or it turned the tide some other way? Let's see. So they needed a large number of employees in different departments, and obviously if they wanted people to work with them, they wanted them to be taught in their own English language. They could not have brought so many people from England, so they had to have local recruits. So their only option was to employ educated Indians who could be less expensive than the Europeans. So it was not that they wanted to educate us Indians because they were very, very generous and they believed in education. No, they had their own reason and own selfish reasons for us to be educated in their language. The Christian missionaries had a belief that new education system would end the belief Indians had in their religion, and then they would be attracted towards Christianity. So they wanted the Hindu population to become Christians, and that is why they introduced their own method of education. Britishers were ruling India and were the masters of it. They wanted the people that they were ruling should speak their language so that they could easily communicate with them. So instead of Britishers learning Hindi, it would have been better that Indians learnt their language. So what are the steps that were taken by the company to introduce this new education in India? So the first thing that started was a Charter Act of 1813 that said that all the schools in India would be teaching English in their schools. Although they did say that regional languages were also okay, but English has to coexist with the Oriental studies. So they also established and reinforced a moral law which said that it has to be English mainly and then the regional languages. In 1835, Lord William Bentinck, he revitalized, re-energized the earlier Charter Act, and he introduced his own new education policy which said that English is going to be the official language in administration and diplomacy. So if you wanted a job in British administration, you had to have that language. So because you wanted jobs, you had to learn their language, English, and that is why not Hindi because Hindi was still a spoken language, but Sanskrit and the other languages were not given due importance. Now, from now on, only those with Western style of education, which means the education that the English introduced, and people who had knowledge of English were eligible for government employment. Then comes 1854, where you have Sir Charles Wood. He published an education dispatch which aimed at widening the availability of Western-oriented knowledge. Now, when you have this Western-oriented knowledge, Western, remember, countries were now democratic, right? And in India, Britishers were still ruling, so we were not independent. Now, when you have Western-oriented knowledge, even the Western thought, even the political forms in the other countries came to India as a reading material, and Indians started reading them. Indians started getting that information and knowledge and understood that we were dependent and we were not an independent nation. And that is how even the feeling of nationalism started. So the Britishers wanted us to be slave of their education and their language, but it turned the tide against them, and nationalism also came in because of this British education, because of the Western oriented knowledge. So universities were established under the London examining model in Calcutta. So London examining model in London functions, they will also be functioning the same way in Kolkata. Earlier it was known as Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. So now you have Kolkata, Mumbai and Chennai. So Now we are going to begin how did the national education started. So the Britishers tried their best to inculcate British values and to impart the English education. But somewhere down the line, that British education, we learned something different. Through that British education, we learned that the other countries are free of foreigners. The other countries have their own rules. There is no discrimination and you have democratic world. So Swadeshi and boycott movement played a lead role in uprooting the very foundation of the British Empire in India. So the Swadeshi movement was all about accepting the products that are Indians, accepting the ways and means that the Indians live, and the boycott movement was all about boycotting the foreign goods and especially the cotton clothes that came over from the British factories. So this was the movement of boycotting of goods that was made in other countries as well. The students started boycotting the Calcutta University as a revolt against the Britishers, and at this point, at this juncture, many eminent persons, many important persons of Bengal got together in a conference on 10th of November 1905. And what is it that these Bengalis decide? That they will have a national college with Aurobindo as principal, and they started in Calcutta. So the first national education started with the national college with Aurobindo as a principal. Now remember, the Britishers had established 3 universities: Kolkata, Chennai and Mumbai. So Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. But here their own national college, which was very Indian, was started. The students who were expelled and teachers were forced to resign were admitted and appointed respectively in these national education institutions. So what happens if you are a freedom fighter and you start fighting against the Britishers, you write something against them, the Britishers would just expel you from the college if you are a teacher or you are a student. But now they had a place called National College to go there and start studying. So they did not had to discontinue their education, and they could also fight for their freedom movement. Now, earlier when I said that there was a big problem with the religion, there was a big problem with the status of women as also. So that is why the role of freedom fighters, the role of social reformers came into being. So what were the problems that were faced by women? The first was female infanticide. This is something that happens even now in many states of India. So female infanticide was when you do not let the female child come into the world. Either they are killed inside the stomach, or the moment they are born, they are killed, because the Indian society at that point of time, and even now, few families, they only want boys, they only want sons. Then low status of women. Why? Because they were not very well educated, they were not independent of their menfolk, they were not financially independent also. So there was no actually status for women. Women were not considered worthy anywhere. Then there was this dowry system, which even happens now. Even now you may hear dowry deaths happening. Child marriage, that is something that luckily has stopped for now. But initially the child marriage, the children were married even at the age of 9 or 10. And if the boy died even in the childhood, the marriage had just been solemnized and the woman was widow, and the widow remarriage did not happen. So being a child who had no idea what marriage was all about, she lives a life of widow where the head was shaved, the clothes were different, and the food was also very different from the married woman. So this child marriage was a very bad system that we had in the Hindu religion. Sati system, that was the first slide that I introduced you, that if the man died before the woman had to commit sati. then there was no education for women. It was only boys, it was only men who were educated. Muslims women were treated not at par with the Hindus. Hindu women were a little better in the status than the Muslim women. So there was a lot of pressure on the working women. There were hardly any working women. So the society did not even understand what are the pressures that a working woman goes through. So there was a need of social reforms in India. The society had to reform, the society had to change from these habits. Only then as a nation could we progress and become modern the way the modern religion and the modern society that we are living in now. So we come to the end of this part 1, education and social reform. So we've learned what was the British education, what was the need to have that British education, was that education successful or it made us more aware of our rights as a democratic nation as we wanted to fight for our own independence. So we are going to continue with this lesson and part 2 in the next session. So bye-bye for now.